what does politics have to do about this? Because you've alluded to this a couple of times. Obviously, the government increasing interest rates changes the value of the bonds, which then puts pressure on the banks that are investing in those bonds, and then they need to have to receive more funding from other places. Then there's a bit of a run on a bank and it just all collapses because someone decided to increase interest rates. I want to kind of look at this from two different angles from politics. First of all, what has politics got to do with this? And I suppose I also want to look at maybe there's some political leaders that are watching. Maybe what should a political leader do? Not necessarily to prevent it, but now what should they do in response to it?
Stop spending. I think it's fairly easy. Look, it's easy to say. It's not so easy to do. My view is that we got into this position because most parliaments around the world are now filled with career politicians.
Yeah.
And most voters care only about their own individual hip pocket.
Yeah.
In other words, we really don't have a system anymore that looks to the national interest. Now, that is not to say that the politicians never do that. I'm not saying that at all. And I'm not saying they're bad people. But what I'm saying is we do have a system, our democratic systems are such that there is now an inbuilt bias on the part of our political representatives to focus on how they can be re-elected at the next election. And that can take their focus off what is in the long-term best interests of the nation. And us voters tend to vote on the basis of what is good for us as individuals, not on the basis of what is good for future generations. In other words, we've got to a situation where we focus on the best interests of the individual in the short term. And it's not just the politicians' fault. We need a massive cultural change. And look, I see this as one of the undesirable effects of walking away from Christianity.
Yeah.
So in Australia today, only about 7% of our population are seriously engaged in church. And honestly, most of them are not that interested in what's happening in the economy. There's a few mad people like me. and there's probably 5 or 6 people in the whole country who really get hot under the collar about these things. So I don't want to put the blame at the feet of politicians in general. It's a two-way street, I think, that has undermined the power of democracy to deliver what is in the best interest of the nation long term.
I really like that. So politicians have a generational view, a legacy view, like looking at what's happening, what is this going to affect generations to come, not just my next term.
So what would happen? Just imagine what would happen if us voters, in unison said to the politicians, we're going to vote for the politicians who can present the best 25-year plan for our nation. I love that.
Uh-huh.
A plan that's going to include our children and our grandchildren. That's what we're going to vote on, not on the basis of what we might benefit or lose in terms of our hip pocket right now. That requires a massive change in our thinking, and dare I say it, that would only happen if we started again to build our nation on Christian precepts.
Yeah, and it does need a political leader to step up and do that.
You bet it does. It really
to lead the way with it.
It does.
And to kind of champion that from obviously we need to vote that way 100%. Like we're all part of that. But I think it needs someone championing it from the front and someone that will get up there and go, right, I'm going to be looking at things generationally. I don't want you to vote on things that I can change in the next 4 years. This is our 25-year plan of how our party will have successor after successor after successor. I'm not going to use any names or any specifics, but I know some people in government and they're doing an incredible job. They are looking generationally for their constituents. And I know I've been part of conversations of who's going to be the person on the bench that's going to step up when this person runs out their time in government, and whether by age or by your end of term or whatever, who's the next person that's then going to carry it on? And they're already starting to plan for that plan going forward, and who it looks like, and what that plan looks like beyond just what I'm doing in government right now. And yeah, we're seeing results of that. I love that. Okay. So that's what we can do. I just want to reconcile just for a moment, because I know that this will help me, but I'm hoping that it will help someone else as well. Is why on earth have they increased interest rates so much? Like I just, if we all know that inflation is bad, and we all know that when there's higher interest rates, like I've got a number of clients that are in the finance industry and things like that, and in real estate and all that sort of stuff, we know that as soon as interest rates go up, it affects people going and get loans. People get a little bit hesitant, and people aren't going to build. People aren't going to buy. It slows that down. It slows everything down. Like, what is? I was going to say, what's the common sense behind it? But you and I both know there is none. But what is the reasoning behind it? Why on earth are they doing it? And is there another way of doing it that doesn't have such a negative impact?
Well, look, fundamentally, inflation happens when there's more demand than there is supply. In other words, when people are wanting more stuff than the economy can actually produce.
Yeah.
You know yourself, in the context of an individual business, if more and more people knock on your door, that's a signal you should be raising your price. Okay.
Yep.
So when businesses generally find that they just haven't got enough stock, or they haven't got enough people to satisfy the demand, they naturally raise their prices. And that is the way in which the market mechanism works, and usually it delivers pretty well. Okay. But you see, when you've got increases in demand that are actually fueled by government overspending, that is, they're spending way more than they are generating in terms of their tax and other revenues, right? That means demand is increasing, because when the government spends, that adds overall to the demand in our economy. So inflation goes up. Now, the problem with inflation is it creates a lot of uncertainty, because you don't know what the inflation rate will be like, say, 12 months or 2 years down the track. Anybody who's on a fixed income loses, right? They effectively become poorer because they can't buy as much as they previously could with their fixed amount of dollars. People, for example, who have, say, got mortgages on a house, they suddenly find themselves wealthier because their house value has increased. And as we feel wealthier, we tend to spend more. So government, usually it's the central banks who are now independent of governments, but they've got inflation targets built into their way of operating. They look around and say, well, okay, we've got this inflation. Inflation is caused by, in a sense, too much demand. So we've got to strip some demand out of the economy. The way to do that is to increase interest rates. And the way in which they do that, they actually get into the market, and they sell off government securities. And in order to induce financial institutions and other organisations in your economy to buy up that debt, interest rates have got to go up. So this is pretty much how it happens. The mechanisms are different in different countries. The definitions of money are different in different countries. But essentially what's happening is the central banks, in order to dampen inflation, they drive up interest rates, and they usually do that by trying to sell the government debt. And look, if people don't want government debt, interest rates have got to go up. It's as simple as that. So what's happening is there's a recognition that there's more demand than there is supply. That causes inflation. The way to deal with inflation is to increase interest rates, because that will reduce demand. Absolutely guaranteed. The timing is a little bit uncertain. That's all. Will it happen soon? Will it happen later? And I think the central banks have generally been surprised that demand has held up as much as it has, But I think a lot of that is because there's been pent-up demand as a result. Governments just gave money away during the COVID crisis. There's still a bit of that yet to spend. See, people don't generally want to hang on to much money because it doesn't derive any benefit to you.
Yes.
When you've got money, you want to spend it, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So that's more or less the mechanism that's been going on. And while ever governments are reluctant to rein in their spending, there will be an inflationary bias in our economy, and that will keep interest rates high because as the government increases its spending, the central banks are going to have to reduce spending, as it were, by the private sector. So that means we consumers end up buying less, businesses invest less, and gradually the economy will slow down. And at the same time, of course, the total amount of employment will tend to fall. So we may well see some increases in unemployment.
So with this increase in demand, inflation just happens organically. That's like what happens if the government doesn't step in and change the interest rate to try to cull that? Does it just spiral out of control? Like why do they try to control it?
It can eventually become what we call hyperinflation, where you get very, very high rates of inflation, and there have been experiences of that in recent times. Even Zimbabwe would be a recent case. Some Latin American countries have also experienced hyperinflation in fairly recent times as well. Hyperinflation is always caused by governments spending far too much money and effectively printing money to cover their debt. So the money itself becomes worthless. I mean, if you run a pie shop and you bake too many pies, you either dump them or drop your price.
Yeah.
And so that's what happens with money. When there's too much money, as it were, people don't want it. So the only thing they can do is spend it.
Yeah. Okay. So the inflation is really caused by the government's printing money?
I would say this round of inflation is primarily caused by governments spending way in excess of their revenue. So they have a large government deficit that has to be funded somehow. And generally speaking, governments have funded their deficits by effectively printing money. What they've done is they've issued debt. That's effectively printing money.
Okay. So it's not necessarily the fact that they've given money away. It's the fact that they're spending in their own budgets, so they need to find that money from somewhere. They create those bonds to be able to sell, Okay, I get it. And then that's what we're talking about, the printing money. And that then has a flow-on effect with Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank and everything like that. Okay, so let's talk about business, Dr. Rod. How does these bank collapses? I've seen a number of interviews of CEOs of organizations, of decent-sized organizations that had their money in, let's say, Silicon Bank or Signature or whatever, and they got a hint towards something was happening, and they just started taking all of their money out of the bank so that they could pay their staff for, and carry on the operations of an organization. It costs money to run businesses. What should we do? And obviously that then fuels the problem and then makes it worse because everyone's doing this run on the bank kind of thing. But how does this, other than the fact that a business might have limited access to their money, how does these banks collapsing affect business? And let's kind of more talk small to medium-sized business, because that's kind of, Look, how does it affect them?
If this kind of thing gets out of hand, there'll be two effects. One, businesses with large deposits won't be able to get their hands on their money. So if they're paying, their workers by withdrawing money from their bank accounts, they might not be able to access that money. I'll come back to some of the technicalities of this soon. The other effect would be if they have borrowed from a bank, the bank could require that their loans be repaid. And then that would cause the business to scramble for its own liquidity by either laying off staff to reduce their costs so that they can conserve their cash, or by selling off assets, or maybe even ultimately themselves going bankrupt. So the effect would then propagate throughout the economy, and you're right to focus on small and medium enterprises because they are the ones who tend to have to run leaner. They don't have a lot of cash reserves. They may well be relying on the bank for seasonal financing and so on and so forth. So two effects: they may not be able to withdraw from their deposit accounts, and their loans might be called in which case they would scramble for liquidity, but they might end up having to close simply because they lack the cash to be able to pay their ongoing expenses. Now, that isn't happening. I hasten to add that isn't, and the reason it isn't happening is that in the United States, government and government instrumentalities have stepped in. They're saying depositors won't lose any money at all now. So it's not just the $250,000, which is guaranteed. Effectively, all deposits are guaranteed. And the authorities are doing all they can to keep the banks going. So they're not actually closing their doors. Now, the technicality that I referred to a little earlier is something that worries a lot of Christians, because I run into Christians and have discussions about this all the time. Christians worry that money is not backed by commodities. In other words, it's not backed by gold. They worry that money is backed purely by our confidence in it. That's actually true, all right? Mm-hmm. The only reason why money has any value is that you and I have confidence that we can use it to pay for something, okay? That I can use money to put diesel fuel in my car. I can use money when I go to the supermarket. My confidence in that money is what actually gives it value, okay? Now, governments are well aware of this, and so they would do everything they can in order to ensure that that money has value. Most money isn't cash.
Yep.
In Australia, about 98% of money is actually deposits in financial institutions. And it's not cash in the vaults of those banks either. It's basically computer entries, all right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, when
it's ones and zeros.
That's right, it's ones and zeros. It's all computer language. The problem with collapses in banks is that deposits disappear.
Yeah.
Okay? If a bank collapses, deposits disappear, that causes the money supply to drop. Now, one of the things we learned from the Great Depression in the 1930s was you should never, ever, ever allow the money supply to fall, all right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, being an economist, of course, I follow these things, and my mum always says how boring it all is, but I find it exciting.
I love this stuff. It's exciting.
If you have a look at what happened to share prices in the famous 1987 share market crash, share prices behaved almost identically to the way in which they behaved in the 1929 share market crash. But guess what? The world didn't lurch into a global recession, depression, I should say.
Yeah.
The reason? We learnt the lesson from the Great Depression. The authorities knew that they couldn't allow deposits to disappear. In other words, they couldn't allow a whole lot of banks to fail. And so they didn't, right? They made sure that was the case. I believe that one of the intended results of the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the United States was to do great damage to the financial system. The authorities were, I believe, aware of that. So they stepped in and they shored up the financial system to minimize the number of banks that went belly up.
Yeah.
As a result, they stopped deposits, that is money, disappearing.
Yeah.
All right. Exactly the same thing happened again in the global financial crisis. Yes, some banks went belly up. Yes, some people lost money, but no, on the whole, deposits didn't disappear. That is, the money supply did not fall. You see, if the money supply falls, we've got nothing to go and spend. If we've got nothing to spend, demand slips in an economy, and that's what causes recession or worse, depression. Economists, central banks, even politicians learnt a big lesson as a result of the depression in the 1930s, and fortunately, we've remembered that lesson. So despite the doom and gloom that you hear, despite the fact that many Christians are anxious because they know that money is only backed by our confidence in it. If we lose confidence in governments, for example, money will really have no value. Despite all of that, governments and banking authorities have shown great wisdom during potentially calamitous times. So I'm fairly confident that this is just a blip. We don't know with 100% confidence, but certainly people like myself who are trained in economics, who have observed what's been going on in financial markets for a long time, and who have also read a lot of economic history, we're not going to be too worried about what's happening at the moment.
Okay. And for small businesses, what's some practical things that they can do? Because you say like the only thing is really the deposits, but you kind of explained that, well, our deposits are safe, right? That's what they made sure of, that at least our deposits are made, they say. The one thing that obviously comes to mind is margin, right? Just always, like, this emphasizes the importance to have margin. If you're running month to month, then any little change is going to affect you and your business. But if you can create some margin in your finances, great.
Hey, that was an excerpt from our On the Cube Leadership podcast. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, put a comment below. And if you want to see more content like this, faith-based leadership development content, make sure you check out our channel, give it a subscribe, and hit the bell notification so that you'll be notified when we release new content.